They spoke of her before they ever looked at her, which was the first cruelty of that evening and not the last. In the great chandeliered hall of Ashcombe House, where candlelight trembled like nervous breath upon crystal and gold, her name passed from lip to lip as a thing already decided. Forgotten. Inconvenient. Best kept unseen. The eldest daughter, they whispered, as though the word itself were a miscalculation that society had tried and failed to correct. She stood at the edge of the room, half concealed by a marble column veined like old bone, her gloved hands folded with careful modesty. The gown she wore was not ugly, only modest to the point of apology, its dove-gray silk dulled by years of careful mending. While others bloomed in jewel-toned silks and daring lace, she seemed to fade into the background, a shadow cast by brighter bodies. Yet her posture was upright, her chin held with a restraint learned through long discipline. Dignity when starved does not die. It sharpens. Across the hall, laughter rose and fell like practiced music. Fans fluttered, jewels flashed, and names of consequence were exchanged as currency. Her stepmother presided at the center with the ease of a woman long accustomed to command, her smile polished, her voice sweetened with false concern. When eyes drifted too near the column, a subtle turn of the wrist redirected attention elsewhere. It was not that the eldest daughter was forbidden to attend. It was simply understood that she should not be noticed. She had learned early the art of invisibility. As a girl, she had been praised for silence and corrected for presence. Each year, her absence from the family portrait became less remarked upon, until even servants forgot to include her name when counting heads. Tonight was no different. She was here because tradition demanded it and ignored because society preferred it. The announcement came midway through the evening, delivered with ceremonial gravity. The family's alliances, their prospects, their future, all spoken aloud as though fate itself were being negotiated over wine. A younger sister's impending match was met with approving murmurs. Hands clasped. Smiles widened. The eldest remained still, absorbing the familiar sting, reminding herself that expectation was a luxury she could not afford. Then the air changed. It was not immediate nor dramatic, but perceptible to those who had learned to survive by attention. A subtle pause in conversation. A tightening of voices. The servants straightened as one. At the far end of the hall, the doors were opened wider, and the footman announced a name that carried weight like a drawn blade. The Duke had arrived. He entered without haste, his presence commanding not through noise but through certainty. Tall, dark-coated, severe in bearing, he moved with the contained force of a man accustomed to obedience. His expression was composed, yet his eyes missed nothing. The chatter softened into reverent silence. Heads inclined. Even the stepmother's smile recalibrated itself, becoming something deferential. She did not look at him at first. Men of power had learned not to see her, and she returned the courtesy. But she felt him all the same, the way one feels a storm before the first drop falls. When she did lift her gaze, it was by accident, drawn by a sensation she could not name, and found his eyes already fixed upon her. There was no immediate recognition, no smile, no signal she understood. Only a look held a moment longer than propriety allowed. His brow did not crease in judgment. Instead, there was calculation, curiosity, and something quieter beneath it, like respect held in reserve. She looked away first, her heart tightening with an emotion too dangerous to welcome. The evening resumed its careful rhythm, yet the balance had shifted. The Duke spoke little, offering measured responses, declining invitations with polite brevity. He watched. And when he moved through the crowd, his path curved, subtly, inexorably toward the margins. Her stepmother noticed too late. By the time she turned, the Duke had already stopped before the marble column. His shadow fell across the dove-gray silk, and for the first time that night, the eldest daughter was fully visible. "Good evening," he said, his voice low, carrying without effort. "You have been standing alone." It was not an accusation. It was an observation, delivered with a calm that made it impossible to deny. She inclined her head, unsure how to answer without trespassing upon boundaries she had spent her life respecting. Around them, the room seemed to hold its breath. "I find," he continued, "that those overlooked often see most clearly." Something stirred in her chest, sharp and unwelcome. No one had ever spoken to her as though her solitude were a choice rather than a sentence. She met his gaze again and this time did not look away. Across the hall, her stepmother's smile faltered. The Duke did not offer his arm, nor did he retreat. He simply remained, an immovable presence, forcing the space around her to acknowledge what it had long denied. Murmurs rippled outward, curiosity sharpening into speculation. She felt the weight of attention press upon her shoulders, heavier than any rebuke, yet within it was a strange warmth, the unsettling sensation of being chosen to exist. Her breath steadied. Somewhere within the music, a note faltered. The Duke's gaze did not waver, and in that unspoken exchange lay a promise neither of them yet dared to name. Tonight, she sensed, was not an ending but an opening, and whatever price visibility demanded, it would be paid under every watching eye, with consequences that would echo far beyond the walls of Ashcombe House before dawn broke upon them all. The Duke did not leave her side immediately, and that alone altered the evening's course. His presence drew a quiet radius of attention, an invisible line others hesitated to cross. Conversation thinned near them as though sound itself feared intrusion. She felt it keenly, this sudden exposure, like standing beneath a skylight after years in a cellar. Every instinct urged retreat, yet something steadier held her in place, a fragile courage born of having nothing left to lose. "You are the eldest," he said, not as inquiry but recognition, his eyes studying her face with a consideration that neither weighed nor dismissed. "It shows." She did not know how it showed. There were no ribbons of authority upon her gown, no inheritance glittering at her throat. Perhaps it was only the way she listened, or the restraint that had shaped her into stillness. "It has not been an advantage," she replied carefully, aware of how many ears strained toward them. "But it has been instructive." A flicker crossed his expression, something like approval tempered by restraint. He inclined his head, acknowledging the answer without demanding more. Around them, the gathering resumed its murmur, though altered now, sharpened by curiosity. She felt the pressure of eyes upon her back, the calculation of worth being hastily revised. A servant approached with a tray offering wine to the Duke. He accepted, then did something small and devastating. Without flourish, without spectacle, he extended the second glass toward her. It was a courtesy no one had thought to offer all evening, and its simplicity struck harder than any grand gesture. Her fingers hesitated before closing around the stem, conscious of the ripple it would cause. When she lifted the glass, a murmur broke loose, delicate and incredulous. Across the room, her stepmother's gaze hardened. She moved swiftly, intercepting the flow of guests with practiced charm, her smile fixed as porcelain. "My dear," she called, voice silken with false warmth, "you must not trouble his grace. He has traveled far." The Duke turned to her at once, his politeness edged with something immovable. "On the contrary," he said, "I find the conversation most refreshing." The word echoed. Refreshing. Applied to the one person society had deemed dull enough to erase. The stepmother's smile tightened, the corners straining. "She is unaccustomed to such company," she pressed gently. "It would be cruel to overwhelm her." Cruelty, named at last, hovered between them. The Duke's gaze cooled. "I trust," he replied, "that she is capable of deciding what overwhelms her." The silence that followed was profound. The eldest daughter felt her breath steady, her spine straighten. No one had ever defended her capacity aloud. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it settled into her bones like warmth after cold. Music swelled, summoned by a hostess desperate to smooth the rupture. Couples moved toward the floor. The Duke glanced at her, a question unspoken yet unmistakable. She felt the risk keenly. To refuse would restore the old order. To accept would mark her indelibly. She placed her glass upon the tray and inclined her head. "If you wish it," she said, the words trembling only slightly, "I will." He offered his arm then, formally, and the contact was light, correct, yet it sent a tremor through her that no one could see. As they stepped into the open space, the room seemed to constrict around them. Whispers followed, sharp as pins. The music carried them forward, and she moved as she always had, with precision learned through observation rather than instruction. The Duke adjusted his pace to hers without comment, an instinctive courtesy that steadied her. They did not speak while they danced. It was unnecessary. In the measured turns and controlled distance, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of restraint mirrored. She felt herself seen not as a curiosity but as a presence. When the music ended, applause scattered uncertainly, and the Duke released her with a bow that acknowledged her as an equal partner. The evening fractured after that. Guests approached with newfound interest, inquiries thinly veiled as concern. Compliments were offered, then withdrawn, recalculated. The stepmother worked tirelessly, redirecting attention, planting doubts with gentle precision. Yet each attempt seemed to falter, undone by the simple fact of the Duke's continued regard. At supper, a place was set for her nearer the center than ever before. The chair felt unfamiliar beneath her, the silver heavy in her hand. She ate little, listening more than speaking, aware that every movement was noted. Across the table, the Duke engaged others with minimal effort, yet his attention returned to her again and again, a steady tether amid the swirl. A gift arrived unexpectedly, borne by a footman bearing the Duke's crest. It was not jewelry, nor anything ostentatious, but a small leather-bound volume, its edges worn by use. When she opened it later in a quiet alcove, she found it filled with marginal notes in a precise hand, observations on history and human nature. No inscription marked it as hers, yet the intention was unmistakable. Knowledge offered without claim. The scandal followed swiftly. A whispered suggestion that the Duke's interest was mere amusement. A sharper rumor that she sought to entrap him. She heard fragments as she passed, felt the sting without allowing it to show. When she looked up, she found him watching her as though measuring the cost. As the night waned, he approached once more, his voice low. "They will not be kind," he said simply. "Are you prepared for that?" She considered the question, the years behind it, the silence she had endured. "I have been prepared all my life," she answered. Something resolute settled in his gaze, and though he said nothing more, the distance between them closed by an invisible degree. From the shadows, her stepmother watched, understanding at last that what had begun could not be quietly undone. Fate once awakened moved silently, now rearranging loyalty's futures and the order itself. The house quieted after midnight, as though Ashcombe itself had grown weary of pretending. Candles guttered lower, their smoke threading the corridors with the faint bitterness of spent wax, and the last carriage rolled away beneath a sky rinsed clean by rain. She moved through the dim passages with unhurried steps, guided more by memory than sight, her thoughts still echoing with voices that had spoken her name aloud for the first time in years. The evening clung to her like perfume, unsettling and difficult to discard. She sought the small library at the rear of the house, a room overlooked by most, its windows opening onto a neglected garden where ivy claimed the stone without apology. It had been her refuge since girlhood, a place where she could sit unnoticed and read until the world softened at its edges. Tonight, the air inside felt altered, charged with something expectant. She reached for the lamp, hesitated, then lit it, allowing its glow to pool gently over the spines of books and the polished surface of the desk. "You favor quiet rooms?" a voice observed behind her, calm and unmistakable. She turned, startled but not frightened. The Duke stood just within the doorway, his coat removed, his cravat loosened, the severity of his public bearing eased by shadow. He had closed the door with care, as though mindful of the fragile stillness. For a moment neither spoke. The intimacy of the space pressed close, and she felt again that unsettling sensation of being fully seen. "I have found them safer," she said at last. "They do not ask one to perform." He inclined his head, acknowledging the truth without comment. "I hoped you would permit me a moment," he said. "It is rare to find honesty unguarded by an audience." She gestured to a chair, though she did not sit herself. Habit kept her standing, ready to retreat. He took the seat slowly, his gaze never leaving her face. The lamplight revealed lines of thought at the corners of his eyes, a gravity earned rather than assumed. "You have been spoken of tonight," he continued, "by many who know nothing of you. I wish to hear you speak for yourself." The request unsettled her more than accusation would have. She folded her hands, feeling the familiar instinct to deflect, to diminish. "There is little to say," she replied. "I have lived quietly." "Quiet lives often contain the most," he said. "They are merely unadvertised." Something within her loosened, a tightness she had long accepted as permanent. She moved at last to the window, placing the glass between herself and the room, though her reflection returned her gaze unchanged. "I was taught," she said, her voice steady, "that my presence complicated matters. That harmony required my absence." He did not interrupt. The silence he offered was deliberate, generous. Encouraged, she continued. "When my father died, I became a reminder of what had been lost. It was easier to pretend I was not there than to account for me." He rose then, closing the distance by a careful step, not invading but approaching. "And you accepted this?" "I endured it," she corrected softly. "There is a difference." A faint smile touched his mouth, not of amusement but of recognition. "Endurance," he said, "is a formidable teacher." She turned from the window to face him fully. The lamplight caught in her eyes and she did not look away. "You asked why I am prepared for unkindness," she said. "It is because I have already survived indifference. Cruelty announces itself. Neglect is quieter." The weight of her words settled between them, intimate and irrevocable. He regarded her with an intensity that made her breath hitch, yet his voice when he spoke was controlled. "I noticed you," he said simply, "because you were not striving to be noticed. There is power in restraint and loneliness in it too." Her heart beat harder, the sound loud in her ears. "Power," she repeated. "It has never felt like mine." He shook his head once. "Power is not always exercised aloud. Sometimes it is the refusal to be reshaped." She felt tears gather, unwelcome but honest. She had learned to master her expressions, but this moment asked something different. "If you see me," she said, "then you see what others will resent. I will not be a novelty, nor a rebellion staged for an evening." His response came without hesitation. "Nor would I ask you to be." The certainty in his tone unsettled her more than doubt could have. She took a breath, steadying herself. "Then understand this," she said, each word chosen with care. "I will not accept protection that costs me my dignity. I will not be elevated as an exception while others remain unseen." He met her gaze evenly. "I would offer nothing less," he said, "and nothing that binds you without consent." The words struck deep, resonant. For a moment, the world seemed narrowed to the space between them, the past loosening its grip. Outside, the garden stirred, leaves whispering against stone. She felt the shift within herself, a door opening where there had only been walls. A knock sounded suddenly, sharp and intrusive. She flinched. The Duke did not. His expression hardened, the private gentleness retreating behind formality. He stepped back, restoring the distance they had crossed. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "will demand answers neither of us has yet given." She nodded, understanding the weight of what lay ahead. As he reached for the door, he paused, his hand resting upon the latch. "But know this," he added without turning. "I do not withdraw once I have chosen." The door closed softly behind him, leaving her alone with the echo of his words and the knowledge that the shadows which had shaped her life were beginning irrevocably to give way. The following day rose with deceptive calm, pale sunlight slipping through lace curtains as though nothing in Ashcombe had shifted. Yet beneath the ordered rituals of breakfast and correspondence, tension coiled like a drawn wire. Servants spoke softly. Doors closed with unusual care. News travels quickly in such houses, carried on glances and pauses, and by mid-morning it was clear that the previous night's disturbance had not faded but sharpened. She dressed with deliberate composure, choosing a gown of quiet elegance, its lines simple, its color restrained. It was not chosen to please but to steady herself. As she descended the staircase, she felt the familiar pull of habit urging her to disappear, yet she resisted it, one measured step at a time. In the drawing room, her stepmother waited, seated with rigid grace, a letter clenched in her gloved hand like a verdict. "You have invited scrutiny upon us," the woman said without preamble, her voice low and controlled. "This house does not survive on sentiment." She listened as she always had, allowing the words to pass through her without lodging. "I did not invite anything," she replied evenly. "I responded." The stepmother's eyes narrowed. "You mistake attention for value. The Duke's interest is dangerous. It encourages expectations you cannot fulfill." A familiar accusation sharpened by fear. "Expectations," she said, "are not mine to manage." The door opened then and the room shifted around the Duke's entrance. He bowed with formal precision, acknowledging the tension without feeding it. "I believe," he said, "that it is expectations precisely which must be clarified." The stepmother rose, her composure immaculate. "Your Grace," she began, "this matter has grown disproportionate." "On the contrary," he replied calmly, "it has been delayed too long." The words landed with weight. She felt it in her chest, the tremor of something irrevocable drawing near. The Duke turned to her, his gaze steady. "I have requested a gathering this afternoon," he said. "There are matters best addressed openly." The stepmother's breath caught only slightly. Such publicity would be unwise. "Secrecy," the Duke returned, "is often mistaken for wisdom." By afternoon, the house filled once more, summoned guests assembling with avid curiosity. The atmosphere was taut, anticipation humming beneath civility. She stood beside the Duke in the central salon, aware of every eye upon her, the scrutiny sharp but no longer paralyzing. He did not touch her, yet his presence anchored her, a silent assertion that she did not stand alone. The stepmother spoke first, her voice carrying with polished authority. She laid out her narrative with careful restraint, painting the eldest daughter as fragile, unsuitable, a relic of grief best protected from disappointment. It was a masterful performance, honed by years of control. Murmurs followed, sympathetic and relieved. The Duke listened without interruption. When she finished, he stepped forward. "You speak of protection," he said, as though it were a kindness bestowed. "Yet what I have observed is not protection, but erasure." The room stilled. He turned, addressing the assembly. "I have traveled widely," he continued, "and I have learned that society's greatest cruelty is not its harsh judgments, but its quiet exclusions." He faced her then, his voice lowering, carrying none the less. "I choose plainly," he said. "Not in defiance, nor in secrecy, but with intention. This woman stands before you not as a curiosity, nor a concession, but as my equal in dignity." A ripple of shock passed through the guests. The stepmother stiffened, color draining from her face. She stepped forward, protest ready, but the Duke raised a hand. "I will not be persuaded otherwise," he said. "Nor will I accept negotiations that deny her agency." Silence followed, dense and electric. All eyes turned to her. The moment stretched, heavy with expectation. She felt the old instinct surge, the urge to retreat, to make herself smaller for the sake of ease. Instead, she lifted her chin. "I accept no future," she said clearly, "that requires me to be grateful for survival alone. I will be chosen openly or not at all." Her voice did not waver. The declaration was simple, yet it shattered the careful balance of the room. Some guests looked away unsettled. Others leaned forward, newly attentive. The Duke's gaze held hers, unwavering. "Then let it be understood," he said, his tone resolute. "I have made my choice and I will stand by it." The gathering dissolved slowly after that, conversation fractured, alliances recalculated. The stepmother withdrew without farewell, her authority diminished in a single afternoon. As the last guest departed, the Duke turned to her once more. "There will be resistance," he said quietly. "The world does not surrender its hierarchies easily." She nodded, feeling the weight of what lay ahead. "Nor do I," she replied. He smiled then, faint but genuine. "That," he said, "is precisely why this matters." She moved through the emptied salon slowly, the echo of the declaration still ringing in her ears. Chairs stood slightly askew, abandoned glasses caught the dying light, and the air smelled faintly of extinguished candles and shaken certainties. Each step felt deliberate, as though she were learning anew how to inhabit space without apology. The cost of visibility pressed upon her, yet beneath it lay a steadiness she had never known, a sense that something essential had been reclaimed and could not be taken again without struggle. The house itself seemed to listen, walls holding breath, corridors waiting to be redefined by choices no longer made in silence. For the first time, anticipation outweighed fear, and the silence behind her promised not retreat, but a voice preparing to speak. Her pulse quickened, knowing that the next declaration would test loyalty, courage, and love before the world without mercy tonight. As evening settled, she stood alone at the window, watching the grounds darken. The future loomed, uncertain and exposed. Behind her, footsteps approached, measured and familiar, and she knew that whatever came next would be faced not in shadow, but in full, unforgiving light. Dawn arrived without ceremony, pale light spreading across the grounds as though uncertain it was welcome. The house stirred slowly, recovering from the weight of declaration and dissent, and she woke with a strange calm settling in her chest. Fear had not vanished, but it had been reordered, placed behind resolve. She dressed simply, her movements unhurried, and when she descended the stairs, the echoes of the past days followed her not as chains, but as witnesses. The Duke awaited her in the small morning room, sunlight catching the silver at his cuffs, his posture composed yet attentive. He rose at her entrance, offering a bow that held neither possession nor presumption. "You slept," he observed gently. "I did," she replied. "For the first time in many nights." They sat opposite one another, a narrow table between them, laden with untouched tea. Outside, birds moved through the hedges, indifferent to human upheaval. Inside, the air felt charged, not with urgency but with consequence. "Everything that follows," he said, "will be examined. Every gesture, every word." "I know," she answered. "And yet I do not regret yesterday." "Nor should you," he replied. "You spoke with clarity. It unsettled those who rely upon silence." The stepmother did not appear that morning. Her absence spoke loudly enough. Servants moved with quiet efficiency, their glances no longer avoiding her. Some held curiosity, others respect, and a few the lingering residue of old habits, but none dismissed her now. Visibility, once granted, could not be easily revoked. By midday, word had traveled beyond Ashcombe. Letters arrived, invitations suspended between courtesy and calculation. She read none of them. Instead, she walked the grounds alone, the gravel path firm beneath her feet, the autumn air sharp and bracing. Each breath felt like ownership of her own lungs, a private victory. The Duke joined her near the old yew tree, its branches gnarled by age yet unbroken. "This place has shaped you," he said, not as inquiry but understanding. "It tried to," she replied. "I resisted where I could." "And where you could not?" "I endured," she said, the word no longer tasting bitter. "Endurance taught me what I would not accept." He regarded her thoughtfully. "The world will expect gratitude," he said, "for my choice." She stopped walking and faced him fully. "Then the world will be disappointed," she said. "I will not be grateful for being seen as human." A pause followed, heavy but not strained. "Nor should you be," he said at last. "That expectation ends here." The afternoon passed in quiet preparation. A carriage was ordered, not for departure but for presence. As they traveled together into the nearby town, the streets seemed narrower, the air thick with recognition. People watched, some openly, some from behind curtains. She sat upright, her gaze forward, refusing the old instinct to shrink. The Duke spoke to her of ordinary things, grounding the moment in normalcy, as though reminding her that this too was life. At the square, he stepped down first, offering his hand. She took it without hesitation. The contact was brief, correct, yet it carried weight, a signal unmistakable in its intent. Whispers followed them as they moved, but no one challenged their passage. Later, in the quiet of the carriage once more, she exhaled slowly. "It is exhausting," she admitted. "Being looked at." "It will become easier," he said. "Or you will become stronger." "Perhaps both," she said, and surprised herself by smiling. As evening approached, they returned to Ashcombe. The house greeted them with a hush that felt anticipatory rather than hostile. In the great hall, she paused, absorbing the space that had once diminished her. Now it felt altered not because the walls had changed but because she had. "I must leave tomorrow," the Duke said quietly. "There are matters to arrange. Expectations to confront." She nodded, a flicker of unease passing through her. "And when you return?" "When I return," he said, "I intend to formalize what has been spoken." Her breath caught. "Publicly?" "There is no other way," he replied. "I will not build a future on shadows." They stood together in the fading light, the enormity of the path ahead settling between them. Outside, the first stars appeared, tentative and bright. She thought of the girl she had been, hidden and unheard, and felt a strange tenderness for that former self. "If the cost is too high," she said quietly, "you must know that I will not bind you to it." He turned to her, his expression unwavering. "I choose with full knowledge of the cost," he said. "That is what choice means." Footsteps echoed faintly in the distance, servants moving to light the evening lamps. The moment felt suspended, fragile and profound. She held his gaze, feeling the truth of what had begun and the trials yet to come. When he departed an hour later, the house seemed to exhale. She stood at the window long after, watching the carriage disappear down the drive. The future stretched before her, uncertain and exposed, yet undeniably hers. Somewhere beyond the trees, a bell told the hour, steady and resolute. She pressed a hand to the glass, her reflection meeting her eyes with newfound certainty. Whatever awaited her now would be faced without apology, in light rather than shadow, and as the night deepened, she sensed that the world was preparing its final test, one that would demand everything she had claimed and more. Morning arrived with a clarity that felt almost merciless. There was no fog to soften the edges of what had been set in motion, no gentle ambiguity to hide behind. Sunlight poured through the tall windows of Ashcombe House, illuminating every corridor that had once concealed her, as if the estate itself were demanding honesty at last. She stood before the mirror longer than usual, not out of vanity but recognition. The woman reflected there held her shoulders differently now. The years of learned smallness had not vanished, but they no longer ruled her. Downstairs, the household moved with deliberate precision. Servants no longer pretended she was not present. Some greeted her with careful respect, others with uncertainty but none with dismissal. Power, she was learning, altered vision. The Duke had not yet returned, and the absence of his presence felt heavier than she expected. It forced her to confront a truth she could not avoid. Whatever happened next could not depend on him alone. The reckoning came before noon. Her stepmother summoned her to the great sitting room, the very heart of Ashcombe's authority. The curtains were drawn back, flooding the space with light that revealed every fine crack in the walls, every faint imperfection in the grandeur. The woman who had ruled this house for years stood rigid by the mantel, her composure strained thin. "You have placed us all in an impossible position," she said, dispensing with courtesy. "The Duke's intentions have made you a liability." The word no longer cut as it once had. "I was a liability long before he arrived," she replied calmly. "You simply found it convenient." Her stepmother's gaze sharpened. "Do not mistake indulgence for justice. You have benefited from my restraint." "Restraint?" she echoed softly. "Or control?" Silence followed, thick and revealing. For the first time she saw something like fear flicker across the woman's face. Not fear of scandal but of loss. Authority depended on the unchallenged order of things, and that order had begun to crumble. "You were never meant to stand here," her stepmother said, voice lowering. "You were meant to remain manageable." The truth of it settled with startling clarity. "Then this is where we differ," she answered. "I am done being managed." Before another word could be spoken, the doors opened. The Duke entered without announcement, his presence commanding immediate attention. He did not glance at the stepmother at first. His eyes found hers, searching, assessing, and in that moment she understood the weight of what he was prepared to do. "I have returned sooner than expected," he said evenly, "because delay would only embolden false narratives." He turned then, facing the room with quiet authority. "I will be direct. My intention is not provisional. I intend to make my choice known formally and without concession." Her stepmother stepped forward, her voice tight. "You risk binding yourself to a woman without fortune, without influence." "Without deception," the Duke interrupted. "Which is more than can be said for many alliances." The words landed with unmistakable finality. The room seemed to contract around them, the walls listening, history holding its breath. She felt the moment tipping towards something irreversible and realized, with sudden certainty, that she must claim her place in it not as an object of contention, but as a participant. She stepped forward, placing herself beside the Duke, not behind him. "If this is to be done," she said clearly, "it will be done with my voice intact. I will not be spoken for." His gaze flickered to her, something like pride passing through it before he inclined his head. "As it should be." The stepmother's composure finally fractured. "You would undo everything for sentiment?" she demanded. "No," the Duke replied. "I would rebuild it on truth." What followed was not an argument but an exposure. Years of quiet cruelty, of calculated omission, were laid bare not through accusation but contrast. Where the stepmother relied on fear and silence, the Duke relied on clarity. Where she had survived by endurance, she now stood by choice. The balance of power shifted perceptibly, like a tide turning. By late afternoon the matter was settled. The Duke's intention would be announced within the week. Ashcombe would no longer pretend she did not exist. The stepmother withdrew, defeated not by force but by irrelevance. Control had slipped from her grasp the moment silence was broken. As dusk fell, the Duke and the woman stood alone once more in the great hall. The space felt transformed, less imposing, more honest. "This path will not be gentle," he said quietly. "There will be resistance beyond these walls." "I know," she replied. "But for the first time I am not afraid of being seen." He studied her, truly studied her, as though recalibrating everything he had believed about strength. "You were raised in shadows," he said. "Yet you stand as though born to light." She met his gaze steadily. "Light is not kinder," she said. "It is simply clearer." A faint smile touched his lips. "Then let us be clear." The declaration was made that very evening. Not whispered, not delayed, but spoken aloud before witnesses who would carry it far beyond Ashcombe. The Duke named her as his intended, not with flourish but with conviction. Gasps followed, then silence, then the slow, inevitable spread of understanding. This was not a whim. This was power choosing deliberately. As the room reacted, she felt the weight of the moment press upon her, not as burden but as grounding. The girl who had once hidden behind columns now stood at the center of the room, her name spoken without apology. The world shifted accordingly. Later, when the house finally quieted, she stood alone at the window, watching night settle over the grounds. The future loomed vast and uncertain, filled with trials yet unnamed. But beneath the uncertainty lay something solid at last: agency. Behind her, footsteps approached, familiar and steady. The Duke stopped beside her, not touching, not intruding. "It has begun," he said softly. "Yes," she answered, eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. "And this time I am ready." Outside, the last light faded, and with it the final remnants of the life she had endured. What remained was not safety nor certainty, but something far more dangerous and rare: trust.